Hello and welcome to the UK Film Review podcast. This week we are discussing The Long Good Friday. The basic plot summary is businessman slash mobster named Harold Shand, who is in London and he's conducting these kind of international deals because he wants to be a legitimate businessman because he owns a lot of casinos. But then things go wrong when suddenly people around him start dying. He goes on a quest to basically find out who's targeting him, what's going on. I did think it was really good, but it's one of those films that I think can be a little bit confusing on first viewing. But I think it gets a bit better once you put the story together in your head. And once you see it play out fully, it is structured like a mystery. There are things in it that you kind of fully understand once you actually know the answers.
And I would argue that it is a mystery film, really. As much as it is a gangster film, it is a mystery film. Just the detective is a mobster, not an actual detective.
There's also not one where there's a huge list of suspects. I mean, there are a few potential ones, like there's the Americans. There are people that you see from the beginning anyway doing the business, but you still don't really know who they are or what they're associated with. And even when you find out it's the IRA, there's still another person involved, and you do find out later on that it's his right-hand man, Jeff. There is a list of suspects, but you don't really know who the most likely candidate is, which does work because then it means that you're kind of very much in the dark. I think as it goes on, you do suspect Jeff and you do find out that he did have something to do with it, but even the way he had something to do with it is still quite surprising.
There's multiple levels of betrayal to it, which I think makes it really work, and climax doesn't feel like ridiculous overreaction. It feels quite earned. I think it's a really good example of a British crime film. It takes two genres that we're good at, which is the London gangster genre and the mystery film, and it blends them. It's quite violent and intense, but it's got an emotional core underneath it, which I think really makes it work. Probably one of the better examples of some of the tensions that were around in the late 70s pushing into the 80s, which is, I think, really what the film captures, those sorts of anxieties.
Absolutely, especially with things like class and capitalism, even the IRA, obviously, all plays into the story. The main character of the film, Harold himself, is what you'd deem to be an outwardly respectable capitalist. He's very business oriented and he's all about keeping the power that he has. The IRA is constantly adding this pressure to him, and you see him genuinely losing it and breaking down and being angry and doing a lot of bad things while still somewhat keeping this slight level of respectability that then gets fully eroded, especially by the time that he actually finds out what's going on and he murders Jeff in a rage. And then he has that moment where he kind of realizes what he just did, chipping away at that character archetype. I mean, he's already chipped away because he's already a criminal anyway, but it's really, really chipping away at that kind of image.
Harold Shand is a person trying to rebrand themselves, but not really wanting to change. When the film puts him under pressure, it does show at his core, he's a gangster. He solves his problems by beating the shit out of people or shooting them. And as much as he wants to be seen as this respectable businessman, because he thinks, yeah, I've earned what I've got, I deserve the respect for what I've earned, he's not willing to put in the legal work that he needs to do that. And even his deal, if you look at the deal that he's making with Charlie, I mean, Charlie's a mafia boss, and the Councilman Harris is corrupt as hell. He's not making a legit deal. It's not just smart business. There's an underlying level of corruption, intimidation that just comes with who he is, who Charlie is. And sorts of piggybacks off of that.
And that makes it more interesting at the end when he rejects the deal with the Americans. You sort of get the sense that he thinks he's kind of above them. He does give that speech where he's really, really critical of them. He's even kind of slagging off America because he kind of sees himself as better than that. What you're seeing is a guy who thinks he's in the right, thinks he's just doing what he has to do to keep his power. But in reality, the universe is telling him this is not what you are and you deserve everything that is coming to you as well.
It's like he's trying to step out of the box that he's created for himself, and the universe is almost telling him, that's your box, stay there.
You're going to face karma like everybody like you does eventually. I think that is the essence of the film. Helen Mirren, her character, you get the sense that she's doing some of the deals when he just can't, because that's what she ends up doing.
Almost feels like his caretaker at points. It shows that he tries to live his illusions at home, but she doesn't have the same veneer a lot of the characters have.
Not really, even though she has that really upper class received pronunciation accent. She doesn't necessarily seem full of herself in the way that he does.
She also doesn't conceal as much of herself when she's with others. She just deals with problems.
You get that in the scene where Jeff is acting very weird towards her and she is very visibly uncomfortable. She doesn't really try and put on the air of, oh, this isn't making me feel uncomfortable. She just is very uncomfortable. And the bit where she gets pushed by Harold, she's genuinely upset and stuff like that. With her, she's more the realist, whereas Harold is the optimist if the optimist wasn't optimistic.
I would say he's a dreamer. I say he's a dreamer rather than a planner because he doesn't know how he's going to get there. He just thinks his own force of will and his charisma will do it.
It's interesting how these little moments flesh him out a little bit. His interactions with Jeffrey is quite friendly. His interactions with the kids that he gives like the money to. There's just this one line that I quite liked as well, where like he's doing the meeting where he's going to send off all of his guys to find these other criminals and interrogate them. One of them says, "We'll give him a few drinks, we'll just talk." And then he gives them the gun and says, "No, use this, it's cheaper." And not only does it show that he's really money obsessed, but also he's thinking about what's going to happen next. He wants to try and plan accordingly. And it's interesting because there's a bit early on where one of the American mafia people specifically brings up the idea of looking into the future. That is kind of what he is. But the irony is that as much as he wants to do that, you can't see what's coming to him.
What's coming at him always comes from the past.
The stuff that Jeff has done.
I think Jeff's quite an interesting character as well, because like right from the start, there is this sort of uncomfortable energy about him. He's quite subdued as he interacts, and there's points where he just stays quiet in meetings you'd think he'd talk. And it's sort of a subtle little tip quickly. He might know something he shouldn't, or might be involved in a way that he's not willing to tell Harold. And of course, that's eventually what is true.
Because when you watch it on the second time over and you see a couple of these scenes, you know the reveal, and you watch those bits, you can tell that he's thinking they're onto me or they might figure it out. It tips you off that he's weird, but it also tips you off like, okay, he might be involved. Harold does all of this complicated stuff. He doesn't realize that the guy who's responsible for his current predicament is literally right under his nose.
He's clearly not afraid to make himself known. I mean, when he goes into the woman's house, pretty much carves up a boyfriend to get the information that he needs. And then basically he's like, yeah, tell everyone. Same when he does the meat hook. You know, he's a massive, dramatic, scary example. He's like, tell everyone. But it's interesting that not only is it right under his nose, he's literally thought, oh, this is who I think could be coming at me, rather than actually sitting back and looking at it for 2 seconds. He's a bit reckless in that way, which is quite interesting.
And that gets Jeff killed when he actually does finally blab about like the reason why everything's happening. And that whole reveal and stuff like that is a bit interesting because the opening of the film is really, really good sequence, but it is one of those things where it is quite out of context. You know that there's like a money deal happening in a betrayal, but then ultimately like you have that bit and you also have the bit where the widow comes out of the car and spits at Jeff. Like you have these moments and they just have a lot more clarity once you know what's going on. You see that widow again. Jeff, during the explanation, is basically explaining the entire reason why this deal was taking place. He screwed over the IRA and the IRA are getting revenge on the organization that he's a part of. So there should just be a conflict between Jeff and the IRA, but it basically involves Harold and also the people that were involved in the deal as well. It was a deal that was made again under Harold's nose and he didn't know about it.
He's responsible for it. It's almost a bit reflective of the way the troubles with the IRA actually happened. But a big part of the IRA's issues was to do with England's historic crimes against it, really, if you're being honest about it. And that's all stuff that our forefathers did, but we didn't have any sort of say in. It got put upon us as a public.
It's a bit of a symbolic reading, and that kind of is like the thing that then is pushing Harold into this ultimate karmic narrative. It is a bit dated to when it came out. I think there are aspects of it that are fairly resonant. The whole thing about business and capitalism, I think that that's pretty resonant.
A lot of what Harold's struggle is in this film is that he is very much a nouveau rich, working class guy trying to make it. And I mean, spend 10 minutes on Instagram or something like that. You will come across a hustle page or a start, this is how you get out of your 9 to 5 to the, which is very much the ethos that Harold almost lives by. It's I can get to the next point. I can jump out of my class and I can be that class, which to be is the ethos of the gangster film generally. That's what gangster films are all about. But especially in the UK and around the 80s as well, because it was a massive thing with Thatcherism. But I think it's even going to come into sharper relevance in the next couple of years, because obviously you've got the gas crisis at the moment and the cost of living going up ridiculous amounts. Like bills have doubled, tripled, and they're only set to rise further, which means the working class and the wealthier classes, is the way I'll put it, the divide between them is only going to grow.
Therefore, there's this kind of need to get a lot more money. And on a personal level, I think that's also resonant to me. I'm thinking about pensions, and I was recently told when I get older, I might need to have a job where I have to work every single day in order to get a pension that will keep me going financially, whether you're 50, 60, or even if you're just 20, 30, whatever. It's something that is always on your mind. Harold is representative of the kind of person that is not only trying to be that, but is also trying to keep that, trying to keep what he has. And the entire time, that's just constantly falling apart. I think we should talk about acting next. Bob Hoskins Evans gives one of the best performances in any of these kinds of movies.
Surprisingly layered for the role as well. He's playing the family man when he's back in with Victoria, his girlfriend, much more devoted, sweeter figure. He's actively trying to be that. That's not really a front for him in that situation. I'll shake every hand, I'll make every smile, I'll do all of that nouveau riche persona. You've got his working class discomfort, which blends in, and you've got playing the high-edge gangster. So really he's playing 4 distinct parts of the role across different scenes, and it's quite interesting to see him switch between them and blend them at points as well, which makes for quite an interesting contrast.
So you said that there were 4 of them as well. In my mind, the 4th one is Broken Man, the man who is collapsing under pressure. I think that that's the most surprising aspect. Even shown early on when he's like losing it over the death of his friend Colin, you kind of realize that in reality, this guy is not who he wants to be.
I would argue you see that even earlier than that, when he's
Yeah.
fussing about the kitchen in the boat. You know, when he's in the boat and he's fussing about what they're serving. Like, even then, he seems like he's on the bloody edge.
He does have a heavy emotional side to him that he tries to cover up.
There are points in the film he just breaks down when he pushes Victoria. He breaks down. He utterly breaks down. You don't know which side of his world it's coming from. I think that's the important bit. He connects the capitalism with the crime. They're the same thing to him. It's actually quite a socialist film in a way, because you get this almost association with capitalism and crime. And although you get the idea that you can't talk about them together, there's the idea that they are the same in their fundamental effects, which is really, really interesting.
He's so convincing as the boss. He's so convincing as this threatening figure. Accent definitely helps, but he's just so like fearsome as an on-screen presence. But then kind of you start to really feel bad for him. There are just like so many moments where that's like made clear. I mean, obviously the bit that's the most famous is the moment at the end where he finally kind of gets what's coming to him, because it easily could have just cut to black just after the car starts going. It lingers. It's cutting between him and young Pierce Brosnan, who plays the IRA guy who's holding up the gun at him. He's just reacting to what's going on. It's going through the 5 stages of grief. He's realizing that he's screwed and he's sad and angry, but by the end of it, it's like, oh well, I'm gonna die.
He always looks relieved, like the real endpoint. And to be fair, as much as he's like fought through and pushed through and been like the big I am the man, he's sort of lost a lot. His whole life has basically fallen apart. Before he gets to that point, and despite the fact that he won what I almost call a very Pyrrhic victory against the IRA, the fact that he loses in the end, you could just see he's there like, okay, I got nothing. I can kind of just let this happen.
I mean, even then, it's like, yeah, he killed those IRA people, but there's going to be more. And obviously, there is more. He got the final jump on him when he thought that he had defeated them. And even if they hadn't, what the hell else was he going to do? Like, yeah, he still had his organization. It was slightly in shambles. He didn't have the power. Deals off. He'd just be back to square one, probably even less than he had before. It is quite a sad ending, but it's also satisfying. You do want to see him get an actual comeuppance. You're not a good guy and you do deserve some sort of punishment. It's not a happy feeling, really.
Quite empty. It's a very empty ending. I think that in that moment you get put more in his head than you do throughout the rest of the film, because at that end bit when he's accepted it and he's just going, okay, you can tell that there is just a complete and utter surrender. It's almost nihilistic in a way. It's just him going, well, that's life, I guess. It puts you in his head emotionally and just lets you sit there with him.
Completely 100% agree. That is slightly a point on direction as well. The rest of the acting is really good as well. I think everybody has moments to shine, but it is definitely Bob Hoskins' film. I think he totally carries it.
His character doesn't work. None of it works, because
I agree. Yeah.
Every relationship is made in defiance to him. The film is built around Harold Chand, and it's not like, well, of course, because he's the protagonist. It's more like literally every modicum of power in London is built around him, and every reason the characters are where they are is to do with him. So because he starts collapsing, everything starts collapsing.
Move on to the filmmaking. So that was an area that I was mixed on. I do think it is quite well shot. I do think that there are some good like shot choices. I think the direction at the beginning, at the end is really, really great. I love that opening montage. I think it's a really well done piece of filmmaking. It really hooks your attention. Obviously, the cutting at the end, the lingering shots at the end, that stuff works. If I have a flaw, do you think that maybe the filmmaking could have more heightened the emotion of the story? Could have been a little bit more intense and a bit more getting you into feeling the stress and paranoia that he was feeling. Skewed the angles a bit more, maybe edited some scenes a bit faster.
See, I disagree with that, because I think by doing that, you would have lost some of the performance, and I think the performance is more important to it than the actual camera shots. I agree with you about the opening and the ending having the most clear direction. Yeah, the opening definitely hooks you in, and the mystery of it and all that. The ending is it's one of my favourite endings to a film. Like, I love the end. That at the start when you've got Harold on the boat, the choice to have him center of frame as he's giving his speech with all of London behind him.
Yeah, I thought that shot was really good. Yeah, I should have pointed out that shot was great.
That was a fantastic shot, and again, I think that puts you in his head better than anything else would. And yeah, he is quite a bit more relaxed at that point, so the more objective style makes sense. But then I think there's also details you get to see in the wider frame that you then wouldn't take it to the climax. You can see that whole room when he's with the IRA. Quite a lot of it. You can see everything in there. You know for a fact that the IRA have probably got something up their sleeve. Well, that's what you're thinking anyway. You're like, shit. And that gives you tension because you're looking everywhere for something, like you'd imagine he would be, except he's not doing that.
But yeah, because in reality, he's the one who's ambushing them.
But that sets something off in your mind. When the ambush happened to me, I wasn't shocked. It felt right. It felt like it should be happening. I didn't think it came out of nowhere. It didn't feel like a Deus Ex Machina. It felt like a big moment that was very much right. It felt earned. Because as I got to look around and I got to watch him, I realised that the two states didn't meet. And I think the film does things like that quite a bit. Like, there's effective imagery, like objectively showing the violence that he commits. I think there's a better job of showing his paranoia than other things do, because you still get close-ups of gory details. Like when he gets a machete and he slashes through the guy's butt, you get the blood, you get that close. You then get the power dynamics from the wider shot and the way that they use positioning. Choosing it objectively in that way with a few moments of subjectivity ultimately makes the subjectivity stand out better.
I can definitely see what you mean. I guess maybe it's less cinematography and maybe just more like editing. I understand that a faster cutting style would have been out of place in this kind of film, but I do just wonder if maybe it would have increased the tension or not. And that's kind of subjective in general in film, because for some people, quick cutting can keep you on the edge of your seat, and for other people, that can just be really distracting and annoying.
I do tend to fall into I find it quite annoying a lot of the time. Don't go wrong, I don't always. I think a film having an overall general cutting style because sometimes feel a bit forced to me. I like films to change with the tone of the scene. If a scene should be cut fast, it should be cut fast. If a scene should linger, it should linger. The problem I have with a lot of films now is that a lot of the scenes feel the same, or they feel very similar because their rhythm is very similar, because you know that's like, oh, we've got to have 3 seconds, then a cut, or, you know, that kind of thing. I'm not saying it's like that prescriptive, but a lot of films seem to feel like that.
That's almost like a thing that to some people is like unnoticeable, but to other people it is, because like what I think it depends on is how much the film kind of pulls you in. In this film, I was definitely pulled in. Faster pace or more heavy moments of style would have perhaps taken me even further into his head and made me even more engaged.
1 or 2 moments where I'd agree with that. I think the way they shot the scene with Victoria could have done more there. I mean, don't go wrong, it has a couple of shots, but it's mostly told in one wide. Almost seeing her from his perspective afterwards and then getting his reaction could have been interesting. And it would have buried the light a little bit more, didn't really get into the head outside of the performances. I think, yeah, there's points like that. I can see what you mean. But I think there's other points that, in terms of tension, I don't necessarily think that's true, because all you really need for tension, I always go back to the famous example that Hitchcock described, which is all you do is establish that there's a bomb under the table. So that could literally be in 1 or 2 shots. And then you just need to show everyone talking, because you know something's going to happen.
That rule is abided by in the bit where you're finally getting the explanation behind what's going on from Jeff. You do know for sure that he's going to lose it and that Jeff is going to die. It'd be strange if it didn't.
Well, I just wait for when it will. And I think one reason I like that is mostly told in very, very few shots is because when you actually get to the moment, it turns into quite a perspective shot. You get that sense of paranoia, because that strangle's quite intense.
Doesn't he also like cut his throat with glass or something like that?
Yeah, that attack, it's frenzied and it's violent. You get that long build and then an explosion. I think if the film had some closer shots in some of those moments of explosion, I think that would really deal with a lot of the issue.
I'll admit I am stretching. It's not really a big issue at all. Music, really, really good. Main theme is a great theme. It's one that's grown on me quite a lot, because it does slightly hit you, the synth score that they go with.
It seems to not fit with the kind of people that are in the film, but it adds this sort of, I think it's partially because of the disconnect it's got as well. The fact that the contrast is there, I think it sums up the contrast in Harold by having the score just be so modern as well. He's almost an outdated character trying to survive in a modern capitalist world that doesn't need him or want him. I think the synth score very much hammers the point home of this is a new world that's coming in that he's just not a part of.
An 80s style soundtrack that was kind of popular in the 80s, or even somewhat early 70s as well. It does almost sound like John Carpenter-esque at the time, like that was current, when, you know, you maybe expect the score to, I don't know, be a bit more orchestral maybe or something like that. I think an orchestral score would be one that you might expect, but the synth one is, it also kind of tells you, you know, like this is the era, this is when it's set. I just think it's a very well composed score, and I think it's very memorable. It's very, very different tonally compared to when he's walking in and then when he's in the car at the end. Because in the opening bit of it, it almost seems really confident, cool, classy, and it seems like this is a guy who has a lot of swagger.
Gets to that car and someone helps him into that car, like, you know, gives
Mhm.
him opens the door for him. He's got that very much I'm the man. And at the end of it, he just sort of staggers into the car like, just get me the fuck out of here.
And then obviously at the end of it, you know, he's being taken away. And you can say the reprisal of it is a bit ironic, but I also think it's weirdly very, very fitting for that scene as well, even though it was used in a completely different context. It's hard to explain why, but I mean, if you just watch that scene and you just listen to the theme, nothing else could be playing over it.
I think it is absolutely perfect.
But overall, if you want to know what the genre is like, I think it's probably the first one to see.
I think if you want like a British crime film, like, you know, if you want to get into that mindset, this is very much one of the films to start with. I think it's one that will consistently hold your attention, even if you've never seen a film of this genre before. I think it's got one of the better lead performances in one of these films.
I think it has a certain style to it, a certain story, and a certain sense of characterization that sets it apart from what you might stereotypically associate with the genre. And I would highly recommend it.
I think it's one everyone should watch at least once.
I would say at least twice, absolutely. Our next episode, at this point, we have not decided up on a film, but we will just add in text what film we have decided on. See ya.